There's a moment that quietly happens in a man's life when he realizes that peace is more valuable than being understood. And for most men, that moment doesn't come at 30 or 40, it comes much later, after decades of trying to make things work that were quietly draining him the entire time. And this is exactly where Robert Hayes finds himself one early morning, sitting alone in his kitchen just after 6 a.m. A cup of black coffee cooling in his hand while his phone lights up with another long message filled with questions, emotions, and expectations. And for years he would have responded immediately, carefully choosing words, trying to fix, trying to reassure, trying to keep the connection intact. But today something feels different. Not colder, not bitter, just clear. He reads the message once, sets the phone face down on the table, and for the first time in a long time, he doesn't feel the urge to explain himself. And from the outside, someone might look at this moment and think he's pulling away, that he's becoming distant, that age has made him emotionally unavailable. But that's not what's happening here. Not even close. What's actually happening is something far more subtle and far more powerful. Because what most people call emotional distance is often just a man finally recognizing the cost of emotional chaos and deciding, without anger, without drama, and without apology, that he's no longer willing to pay at the cost of living inside that kind of pattern is. Not something you notice all at once. It builds slowly in ways that are easy to ignore when you're younger, but impossible to overlook as you get older. Because at 30 you can recover from emotional strain quickly, you can sleep it off, distract yourself, move on to the next day without thinking too much about what it took out of you. But by the time a man reaches his 60s, he understands something most people never fully grasp, that his energy is not unlimited, that every conversation, every tension, every unresolved moment takes something from him that does not come back as easily as it once did, and Robert has felt that shift in ways he cannot deny anymore. Nights where he lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations that should have been simple. Mornings where he wakes up already tired before the day even begins. Moments where he notices his patience thinning not because he wants it to, but because it has been stretched too far for too long. And this is where the real realization begins to take shape, because it is not about avoiding difficult conversations or refusing to engage. It is about recognizing the difference between something that challenges you in a healthy way and something that consistently drains you without resolution. And once a man sees that clearly, once he feels the physical and mental weight of carrying that tension over time, the question changes completely. It is no longer about how to fix it or how to make it work. It becomes much simpler and much more honest. Is this worth the cost it keeps asking me to pay? And this is where the shift becomes impossible to reverse. Because what Robert begins to understand is not just the cost of these patterns, but the truth behind them, a truth that most men spend decades misunderstanding. He starts to see that what he once called passion was often just instability. What he once believed was emotional depth was sometimes just inconsistency dressed up as intensity. And that realization does not come easily. It comes with memories, with moments that replay differently now than they did back then. Nights that felt meaningful at the time, but now feel exhausting when viewed with clarity. Conversations that once seemed important, but now reveal themselves as cycles that never actually led anywhere. And the hardest part of that realization is accepting that he stayed in those patterns not because he was weak, but because he believed that enduring them was part of what it meant to care. But now, sitting in the quiet of his own space, Robert sees something he could not see before. That real connection does not leave you constantly unsettled. It does not require you to prove your intentions over and over again. It does not make you feel like peace is something you have to earn instead of something that should exist naturally. And this is the moment where everything reframes itself, because he is not rejecting connection. He is rejecting confusion. He is not walking away from people. He is walking away from patterns that slowly erased parts of who he was. And once that line becomes clear, once he can finally separate what feels intense from what is actually healthy, there's no going back to the way he used to see things. What makes this shift even more profound is that it does not come from a single lesson or a single relationship. It comes from repetition over time, from seeing the same emotional patterns play out with different people in slightly different forms. until eventually it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like clarity. And Robert has reached that point where he no longer reacts to what is being said in the moment. He recognizes what it represents. He hears a certain tone, sees a certain kind of question, feels a familiar tension begin to form. And instead of leaning in like he used to, try to fix it or navigate it, he pauses because now he understands where it leads. And that understanding changes everything, because younger men often believe each situation is unique, that if they just handle it better this time, the outcome will be different. But older men like Robert have already tested that theory over and over again. They have adjusted their words, softened their tone, tried different approaches, given more patience, more effort, more understanding, and yet the pattern remained. And this is where experience becomes something powerful, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, grounded certainty. Because once you've seen the same outcome enough times, you stop negotiating with it. You stop trying to outthink it. You stop believing you can reshape something that has already shown you exactly what it is. And that is why Robert no longer feels the urgency to respond. Because for the first time in his life, he is not reacting to the moment. He is responding to the truth he has already learned. What makes this shift even more profound is that it does not come from a single lesson or a single relationship. It comes from repetition over time, from seeing the same emotional patterns play out with different people in slightly different forms, until eventually it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like clarity. And Robert has reached that point where he no longer reacts to what is being said in the moment. He recognizes what it represents. He hears a certain tone, sees a certain kind of question, feels a familiar tension begin to form. And instead of leaning in like he used to, try to fix it or navigate it, he pauses because now he understands where it leads, and that understanding changes everything. Because younger men often believe each situation is unique, that if they just handle it better this time, the outcome will be different. But older men like Robert have already tested that theory over and over again. They have adjusted their words, softened their tone, tried different approaches, given more patience, more effort, more understanding, and yet the pattern remained. And this is where experience becomes something powerful, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, grounded certainty. Because once you have seen the same outcome enough times, you stop negotiating with it. You stop trying to outthink it. You stop believing you can reshape something that has already shown you exactly what it is. And that is why Robert no longer feels the urgency to respond. Because for the first time in his life, he is not reacting to the moment. He is responding to the truth he has already learned. And somewhere in that quiet certainty, something else begins to take shape, something most people would not expect. Because when a man steps away from emotional chaos, he does not become empty. He becomes selective. And that distinction changes everything about how he moves through the world. Because what Robert starts to notice is not just what he no longer tolerates, but what he actually wants. And for the first time in a long time, that desire is not built around intensity or excitement or constant reassurance. It is built around something much simpler and much rarer: consistency. He begins to value the kind of presence that does not shift without warning, the kind of conversation that does not carry hidden meanings, the kind of connection where he does not feel like he has to stay alert to keep things from unraveling. And this is where the real contrast becomes clear, because what once felt engaging now feels exhausting. What once felt meaningful now feels unstable. And what once felt normal now feels unnecessary. And this is not because Robert has lowered his expectations. It is because he has refined them. He no longer measures connection by how intense it feels in the moment. He measures it by how it makes him feel over time, whether it leaves him grounded or unsettled, whether it adds clarity or creates confusion. And once that standard becomes real, once peace becomes something he recognizes instead of something he negotiates for, everything else that does not align with it begins to stand out immediately, not as something tempting, but as something he quietly knows he does not need in his life anymore. Robert sits there a little longer than usual, the coffee now cold, the morning light stretching across the kitchen floor. And for the first time in a long time, there is no urgency pulling at him, no need to reach for the phone, no quiet pressure to fix something that has always required too much of him to begin with. And in that stillness, he understands something that took him decades to fully see, That walking away from emotional chaos is not a loss. It is a return. A return to a version of himself that was always there but buried under years of adjustment, compromise, and silent endurance. And what makes this realization so powerful is how simple it becomes once it is clear, because he no longer has to justify it to anyone. He no longer has to explain why certain patterns no longer work for him. He does not need to convince anyone that his need for peace is valid. He simply lives it, quietly, consistently, without apology, and from the outside some people will misunderstand it. They will call it distance. They will say he has changed, that he is harder to reach, but what they are really seeing is a man who finally understands his own boundaries and respects them enough to stand by them. And that changes everything about how he